Gardeners often hear that kitchen scraps bring worms into the soil quickly, but not all scraps behave the same way. Some rot fast, draw in life within days, and vanish into black humus. Others take their time, releasing odours and breaking down on their own schedule. Among the trickiest scraps are cabbages and their brassica cousins. They rot differently, carry strong sulfur compounds, and often sit longer before worms show interest. So we ran a test. How long does it actually take for rotten cabbage to become worm food? And what can gardeners do to manage it better? Brassicas break down differently than softer kitchen scraps. When fresh cabbage leaves or stalks are buried, they don't break down like lettuce or cucumbers. Brassicas are dense, fibrous, and filled with compounds such as glucosinolates and sulfur, which resist decay in the early stages. Instead of turning soft within a few days, cabbage layers toughen up, hold moisture, and begin to ferment. This stage can last anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks, during which worms often avoid the material. The strong smell of rotting brassicas is a byproduct of this fermentation, and it signals that bacteria are working hard to break down the resistant cell walls. The first stage is bacterial fermentation, not worm activity. For the first stretch after burial, usually between 1 and 3 weeks depending on temperature and moisture, bacteria dominate the process. The cabbage may turn slimy, release a pungent odour, and even foam slightly if packed tightly. At this stage, worms are rarely present. In fact, many worm species actively avoid fresh brassica waste because of the chemical compounds released. It is only after the strongest phase of fermentation passes that worms move in. In our test, worms started to appear around day 18, when the sharp odour had faded and the cabbage tissues had softened enough to tear easily. The real breakthrough comes once the brassica tissue loses its firmness. Around the 3-week mark, the smell lessens, and the material changes from dense leaves into a softer brownish mush. This is when worms begin to swarm. By day 21 in our controlled test, worms were visibly present around the edges of the decomposing cabbage, tunnelling through the surrounding soil and feeding on the softened tissues. From this point onward, the population grows rapidly. The worms are not just eating the cabbage, but also consuming the bacterial populations that have colonized it. By day 30, nearly all of the cabbage had been broken into small fragments, fully incorporated into the soil and teeming with worm activity. Conditions in the soil make a huge difference to the timeline. In cooler weather, the fermentation stage can last much longer, sometimes stretching over a month before worms show up. In warm, moist summer beds, however, the timeline shortens. If the soil is kept damp and the cabbage is mixed with other nitrogen-rich scraps, worms may arrive as early as 2 weeks in. But if buried in dry or compact soil, the cabbage may sit for over a month without significant worm activity. For best results, it's important to create conditions that encourage faster breakdown. Keeping soil moisture steady and ensuring airflow by not compacting the layers helps the bacterial stage pass more quickly, clearing the way for worms. One of the most effective ways to manage brassicas in the garden is not to let them sit alone. When cabbage scraps are buried with high nitrogen materials such as fresh grass clippings, kitchen peelings, or even diluted manure, the balance shifts in favour of faster microbial activity. A practical example is layering 1 part cabbage with 2 parts softer scraps. In this ratio, the nitrogen and quick-decaying material help buffer the slower brassicas, and shorten the waiting period. By blending the scraps, the odour is reduced, and worms arrive earlier because the surrounding environment is already favourable. Once worms take over, the pace of decomposition accelerates dramatically. In our test, the material that had been untouched for nearly 3 weeks was transformed within the following 2 to 3 weeks into rich humus. By the 6-week mark, almost no recognisable cabbage tissue remained. Instead, we found black, crumbly soil alive with worm casts. The initial slow stage was simply the price of entry, but the payoff was a soil layer richer in organic matter and more worm-friendly than before. This highlights that cabbage, while tricky at first, is not waste material at all. It simply demands patience and the right conditions to become an excellent soil builder. For gardeners managing compost piles or burying kitchen scraps directly in the soil, the key takeaway is that brassicas like cabbage will always lag behind softer material in terms of worm attraction. Expect an initial delay of 2 to 3 weeks before worms move in, and plan your scrap rotations accordingly. If you're burying cabbage in a vegetable bed, pair it with greens, keep the soil moist, and give it at least a month before expecting visible worm swarms. If your goal is faster composting, pre-chopping cabbage, or fermenting it lightly in a bucket with other scraps before burial can cut down the waiting time. Patience with brassicas pays off in worm-rich soil. So how long does it take for rotten cabbage to feed worms? The real answer is around 3 weeks before they touch it and up to 6 weeks before it's unrecognizable. While brassicas test a gardener's patience with their smell and slower decay, they eventually provide the same reward as other scraps. Rich humus full of worm life. The waiting game is worth it because these tougher vegetables ultimately add diversity to your soil diet, building resilience in the ecosystem below. If this breakdown of how cabbage rots and when worms finally move in gave you clear strategies for your own garden, make sure to subscribe to Soil Doctor and share this guide with other growers. The more we spread practical knowledge like this, the faster we all learn to turn stubborn scraps into thriving, worm-rich soil.